All right, AP World students, this is the last of my 4 lectures I'll put up on my YouTube channel. These are overall international issues that are in your study guide, various organizations or movements or concepts, and then just some stats I think are interesting that I'd like to share with you. So these are all in your study guide, these first 10 or so, just in different spots in the study guide. So there's a bullet point in your study guide about international organizations. There is something called the International Criminal Court. It is created after World War II. When we start creating international law and holding people accountable, you can no longer say after World War II that you were just following orders if you do something like kill innocent civilians. And so we create that organization to try people for crimes against humanity. It has been used for various warlords, dictators, etc. over the last 75 years. We also want to try to shore up the world's economy. We have something called the International Monetary Fund, which works with poor countries to reduce the level of poverty. Of course, as we talked about with the concept of neocolonialism, if you take an outsider's money, you are then beholden to the outsider's expectations. So if certain countries accept IMF money, they have got to follow certain expectations of policy in terms of how much of their economy they spend on this or that. We also have an organization called the World Bank. The World Bank loans money to any of its member states for various construction projects, rebuilding, etc., etc. Note that the IMF and the World Bank are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and the International Criminal Court is headquartered in The Hague, Netherlands. So these are organizations that are headquartered in Western states. So these are very much associated with Western nations. After the Cold War, former Soviet satellites are going to join these organizations as well. We also create what is called, after World War II, the European economy is very disturbed. A lot of poverty and destruction that takes place. We create what's called the European Economic Community in 1957. This is originally designed for economic growth. And so what it is 6 member states in Western Europe agree to have no tariffs, no taxes on goods across borders. And then there is no labor restriction. So if you're a German and you can find a job in France, you can do so without any sort of paperwork. And when you're done with that job, you come back home to Germany. So it's basically allowing more flexibility and interaction within the nations of Western Europe. And the logic is this will help them improve their economy after World War II. And this is true. Now, eventually this organization will turn into what we call it today, which is the European Union. The European Union has 27 member states, Britain having left that organization just a month and a half ago. 19 of them use their common currency, the euro, which was enacted in 2001 to reduce the confusion and conversion of different currencies as you cross borders. It makes it one currency for most of the member states, and that makes trade increasingly easy and also encourages tourism. Tourists can cross a border without having to show their passport from one European Union country to the other, and they don't have to get new money. They can use the money they've already been using at a time when cash was still prominent in 2001, and it's designed to improve the economic interaction of those states. And it has worked. While the United States is stronger than any one of those states individually economically, the euro is actually worth more than the American dollar. Usually a euro is about $1.10. So it is a strong currency and does help the nations of Europe compete with the United States as an economic power. We also have other international organizations related to different concepts. We have Greenpeace. Anytime you see green in politics, you're referring to the environment. So the purpose of Greenpeace is to peacefully protest, to support environmental causes. They have advocated for against forest deforestation. They've advocated to stop whaling in the Pacific Ocean by Japanese whaling ships. They've advocated for more renewable energy sources, that kind of thing. These are what we call NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They're made up of individuals. They're not made up of states, like the organizations we just discussed, the European Union, the World Bank, etc. We have the World Fair Trade Corporation, which has 401 member businesses and organizations that work to promote what we call fair trade in poor countries. That would just be fair trade that they're not owned by foreigners. It's locally produced, locally owned, and the benefits to the economic development stay in the country of origin, not to a foreign multinational corporation. Speaking of that, the next one is multinational corporation. This is just what it sounds like. These are corporations that are operating in numerous countries around the world. McDonald's is a classic American example. From your study guide, the example I picked was Nestle. Nestle is a Swiss corporation. The reason I picked that one, my older brother works for Nestle. and he is a food distributor. So he sells food to stores and makes sure they have various Nestle products in those stores, and he manages people who do that. It is based in Switzerland. It is the world's largest food company. They sell pretty much something in every kind of food service item you can think of. They have cheeses, they've got desserts, they've got dog food, they've got all of it. They own a little bit of something and everywhere, both human and animal food production. There's an interesting point that changed this past year of the globalization of social media platforms. We have locally developed social media like Weibo. Weibo is Weibo. That is a microblogging platform. Think of it like Twitter, kind of like in China, and it has over 400 million users. But because it is in a government that is a dictatorship, the company Weibo censors posts. They look for certain keywords, and they have strict content controls. They will kick you out or off your platform if you say things against the government. This is pretty easy. Obviously, we have lots of new communication techniques and airplane techniques. We have airplanes in period 4, bullet trains, not necessarily in the United States, but you travel in Europe or Japan or China, you'll see bullet trains. They're called that because they go really fast, some of them over 300 miles an hour. You see new communication like cell phones and the internet, changing the way we live, especially right now, where many of us are working remotely from home or going to school from home. The internet allows that to happen where 20 years ago it would have been impossible. Everything would have stopped pretty much if we were having a similar situation as we're facing right now with the coronavirus. Ironically enough, we also talk about better medicine and scientific techniques in this time period. We develop antibiotics in the 20th century, the first being penicillin in 1928. The global population is about 1.6 billion in 1900. Today it's slightly over 7.6 billion. We have massive population growth, but it has slowed. When I was your all's age, we were told that by 2050 you'd probably have 12 billion people on the planet. Now we estimate we'll have about 9 billion. So we have had a 3 billion person drop in global population expectation over the last 30, 20 years or so. And that is because the increasing industrial progress of many parts of the world, which we know the demographic transition decreases our birth rates. We also, of course, know that we have birth control. The pill is introduced in 1960, and there are many purposes of the pill besides birth control, but that is its most common impact, and that allows women to have, and couples to have more reproductive choice over when they might try to have children. As more women are working and trying to establish careers, it gives them also choices on when to have a child and what we call family planning. We also have new energy methods. Oil really becomes important for the first time in the 20th century, and of course we have nuclear energy as well. There is certainly conflict with the environment. That is part of your study guide as well. Deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, desertification as the Sahara Desert gets bigger every single year. We use more air, we use more water, we fight over these resources. We've had what are called greenhouse gases, things like carbon dioxide, that have contributed to the heat of the planet and discussions about climate change. We also have various kinds of diseases. Of course, we're dealing with one right now in the coronavirus, but there are different kinds of versions of these diseases. There's a category in your study guide about poverty diseases that could be treated, but there are often still problems in poor places like malaria. The simplest way to protect many people from malaria in tropical areas is putting a net over your bed. They often sleep with open windows or no windows at all, so mosquitoes can get in. If you put a net over someone's bed to cover them while they sleep, that costs less than $1, but some people don't have that kind of money and they can't afford it. We also see cholera as a disease of poverty, where we don't have sewage systems and people will get sick from drinking water with fecal matter in it, and that's a problem. As of 2017, it is estimated that 950 million people still defecate outside. 60% of those people in India. We mentioned how India has made massive progress lowering their poverty rate over the last couple decades, but in addition to poverty being a cause of lack of sewage, it's also a cultural factor there as well. And so Gandhi famously once said sanitation is more important in India than independence, before they had been independent from Britain. So we still see cholera killing 1.4 million children a year. The president of India has put up $40 billion to change the perception of sanitation, and we have added 100 million toilets in India in the last 5 years. 5 years. That's impressive. India has seen a 31% decrease in their cholera diseases over the last 30 years, but it's still a problem they are working on. So basic things like sanitation are still something people have to deal with. We also see epidemics, the 1918 flu pandemic. We wrote our DBQ about that. Of course, back then they were limited in their medicine. The problem with the flu is even when we make a vaccine for the annual flu, it's basically an educated guess. It takes a while to do, and the coronavirus, of course, is more resistant to that, and we're working on one right now. But you see the way it's changing our lives is we all basically have to go inside for a while and try to deal with how to issue with these deals. We also have epidemics like HIV in the 1980s. There was no known cure. There's still not a cure, but there's certainly a way to mitigate the disease and make it less harmful. There's also stereotypes about the communities that more frequently got it and the method of transmission. When I was a kid, it was thought like if you sat in a toilet seat after somebody had HIV, you'd get it as well. Of course, that's ridiculous, but there's a lot we didn't know in the 1980s and early 1990s about the way HIV spreads and what it does. There's also diseases as we start to live longer, as we have better health care and more money to afford treatment and better science to help with treatment in the civilized world. We get people having diseases of long life, things like diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, of dementia. As you just live longer at some point for many people, for various reasons, you lose your mental capacities. And so that's something that doesn't happen if you have a society where people live to be 45. When people live to be 80, that's going to happen more often. Now, a couple other kind of random things that I like to close out with, some really interesting details. I've got a couple YouTube videos I'm linking to that I would like you to watch as well about some of these issues, but I'll give you more detail about that on the stream on Google Classroom. Gentrification is the world's population getting older. In 2009, the average person in the world was 29. It is expected by 2050 that will be 38. As of right now, about 11% of the world's population are people over 60. By 2050, that would be about 22% of the world's people. In the rich world, 1 in 3 people is over 60 years of age. In 1900, the average life expectancy in the world, so when we start this time period, was 30. 30. In rich countries, it was 50. Right now, the average lifespan in the world is 67, and in the rich world, 78. So that's pretty amazing. In the early 1970s, the average woman had 4.3 kids. Now that number is 2.6 and 1.6 in the rich world, what we call, to keep population stable, not grow or not go down, you need 2.1 births per woman. So 1.6 in the rich world population outside of immigration is actually going down. Anyway, so in 2050, it's estimated that 1/3 of global population under the age of 30 will live in sub-Saharan Africa, a place where we still have growing populations. A couple other things, kind of randomly, talk about language. It is estimated there are 7,000 languages spoken on the planet. 1/7 of them, 1,000, are spoken only on the island of New Guinea. Because New Guinea is incredibly geographically diverse and also relatively untouched from the outside world. So 1,000 of the 7,000 languages on the planet are spoken on one island, which is pretty amazing. Most people in the world speak one of 5 languages: Chinese, Spanish, English, Arabic, or French. That is pretty amazing. 78% of the world's population speaks the 85 largest languages. The smallest half of the languages only have 8 million people speaking them total. So there are more people in New York City than speak half of the world's languages combined. That's pretty amazing. All right, a couple other things randomly. We talked about poverty really decreasing over the last couple decades. Between 1990 and 2010, the percentage of people globally living in poverty went from 43% in 1990 of the world was in poverty. That is again defined as $1.25 a day or less. To 2010, that figure is 21%. China is responsible for 3/4 of that decrease. In 1980, 84% of Chinese people lived in poverty. In 2013, that number was 10%, which shows you the massive growth of the Chinese economy. Also, I think this is fascinating. In 2016, the world's 62 richest people had as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the planet. The top 1% of global population had as much money as the rest of the 99% combined. Now, we talk about poverty. In the United States, our poverty is a little different. If you looked at the top 10% of assets, like what you own, and cash, the figure you would have find in American dollars that makes the top 10% of richest people in the world is $68,800. $68,800 makes you in the top 10% in the world in wealth, annual income. To the top 1% is approximately $760,000 of assets and wealth in a year. So that's pretty impressive there, that $68,800. We look at poverty. Again, we have poor people in this country, but that level of poverty, the average American makes about $65,000 a year. Now that includes really, really rich and then people in poverty. But, so the top 10% is almost the entire American state on average, at least anyway. So that shows you some of the discrepancies we have in wealth. So those are just some overviews of some global statistics, some organizations, etc. We will cover anything else that's missing in our review that's going to take place later this week. So I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.